My first ski vacation with my three best friends, Angel, Amy, and Jessica, started off with a bang. We flew straight to Colorado and rented an Airbnb in the town of Snowmass, right next to the famous Aspen Mountain Ski Resort. I had only ever tried skiing once before, and that time I had only dared to try the small beginner slope, which resulted in me falling over and not being very good at it. We took an Uber from the airport to the Airbnb. It was a spacious four-bedroom house, especially with a large balcony with a hot tub overlooking the beautiful Colorado landscape. Since it was already evening when we arrived, we decided to go out to a local bar to enjoy the Colorado night air. That first night, we had a fun Thursday night. The next day, we woke up early and took an Uber straight to the ski resort. We rented ski equipment right there for convenience. The first day, the ski area wasn't too crowded, probably because it was a work day. But the second day, the crowds were much larger. Despite my best efforts, I still couldn't get used to skiing. I couldn't ski down the slope without falling at least a few times. At one point, I was so tired that I decided to sit down on the side of the slope to catch my breath. While I sat there, many other people, including small children, passed me with ease, which made me even more discouraged. Suddenly, a man appeared who didn't seem very used to skiing either. He approached me and asked if I was okay, then tried to strike up a conversation with me. This was strange because we were in the middle of a crowded mountain and not the ideal place to have a conversation. After a few short replies, I got up and said it was nice to talk to him and continued skiing down the slope. This slope was a blue route, meaning it was longer and more difficult than the green routes for beginners. I stopped again to rest, and to my dismay, the man from before appeared again. He was still struggling to control his skateboard and stopped right next to me. He then took off his skateboard and sat down a few meters away from me, continuing to chat and saying that he was not used to having so many beautiful girls like me here. This was really weird because I was wearing a helmet and a mask covering my face. He asked me who I was with. I lied and said that I was with my boyfriend, but he laughed and said that he had seen me come here with a bunch of girls. I felt disgusted and let out a loud "ooh" and quickly slid down the slope to get away from him. I slid faster than ever, probably because I felt threatened and wanted to get out of there quickly. When I got to the bottom of the mountain, I ran into the lodge and sat down at one of the tables, immediately calling Amy. I told her what had happened and asked her to come sit with me. A little while later, I saw Amy coming, and I texted our group chat that we should leave. It was almost 3 p.m., and we had been here for a few hours. When Angel and Jessica finished their climb, we met up at the lodge, returned our gear, and headed back to the Airbnb. After showering and changing, we went out to dinner in a nearby village, then went to a few local bars and got drunk. When we got back to the Airbnb, the four of us soaked in the hot tub on the balcony and continued drinking. After a while, we went to our rooms to sleep. I'm a light sleeper and spent over an hour scrolling through TikTok on my phone. Even though I was still a little tipsy, I didn't feel sleepy, which was a real blessing in disguise. I started hearing footsteps in the common area, probably in the living room or the kitchen. At first, I thought it was probably one of the girls getting some water or going to the bathroom. But then I heard the doorknob of my room turn. I sat up and was about to call out one of their names, but I stopped because it didn't feel right. Why was someone trying to get into my room? I immediately texted the group chat and asked who was out there, but no one answered. They must have fallen asleep. I crept up to the door and pressed my ear to listen. I heard footsteps moving around. When it was quiet, I very gently unlocked the door and turned the knob. I pushed the door open slowly and looked around the living room. I looked from corner to corner until I saw a tall, dark figure walking from door to door. It was definitely a man. He was trying to get into one of our rooms. I wanted to scream to warn my friends, but I was too scared and just stood there silently. I closed the door softly and locked it. I prayed that everyone had locked their doors since we were only 4 girls in an Airbnb. Of course we had. I called 911 and whispered the whole thing over the phone. As I did, I heard a light knock on my door. I turned back to the door and saw the doorknob turn again, but he couldn't open it. I kept begging for the police to come quickly, but the woman on the line just repeated that they were coming and asked me to be quiet. He must have heard me whispering because he started pushing on the door. I heard banging and banging on the door, and I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I yelled, "Get out of here!" and continued, "I'm calling the police." The banging stopped and a voice from the other side of the door said, "Okay, honey." Then I heard his footsteps walking away. The 911 operator instructed me to stay in the room until the police arrived. I looked out the window, but it was too dark outside to see anything more than a few feet in front of me. My friends had woken up because of my screaming. I told them all to stay in the room until the police arrived. The police finally arrived after about 5 to 10 minutes and went straight into the Airbnb because the front door was unlocked. After confirming that the intruder had left, we locked and secured all the doors. Sleeping after that was extremely difficult. We began to suspect that the strange man from the mountain might have been the one who had followed me and broken into the Airbnb. His voice matched the voice I had heard through the door. After working with the landlord to get a partial refund, we spent Sunday exploring the area instead of skiing. We picked a small hotel to stay the night and flew home Sunday morning. Since I was a child, my father always told me, "Don't be afraid of ghosts, be afraid of the living, for they are the ones who can hurt you." That saying was deeply imprinted in my mind, but I never thought I would experience it in such a terrifying way. When I was a teenager, I received an inheritance after my father committed suicide. At the time, my parents owned a cabin deep in the woods near Mount Bachelor, Oregon. However, after my father's death, my mother could not afford to continue paying the debts related to the house. The house was put up for sale and was in the process of being finalized. During the time of sale, the house would be empty. I saw this as an opportunity to get away from my tiring and troublesome life. After quitting my job, I packed my things, grabbed my skis and my beloved dog Midnight, and drove up to the cabin in my dad's car. The first 2 days went by normally. Midnight and I played in the snow during the day, and at night I watched movies, played PlayStation, and sat on the balcony drinking and smoking. The house was 2 stories, with a living room, kitchen, and a small bedroom on the ground floor. Upstairs, there were 2 more bedrooms and a balcony that connected to the master bedroom. Most of the time, I was only in the living room, kitchen, and master bedroom, and I kept the doors to the other rooms closed. I felt pretty relaxed after what had happened before. On the 3rd day, when it was snowing heavily, I decided to stay inside instead of going skiing. That's when things started to get weird. There were only 2 other cabins in the area, about a block away from mine, and the others were miles away. I knew for sure that no one was in the other 2 cabins, but when I went out to play with Midnight, I saw footprints in the snow around my cabin. The snow was still falling, so the footprints looked like they had just appeared not long ago. I thought that maybe someone was nearby, and I hadn't noticed, so I didn't pay much attention and went back inside. That night I went to bed early, but after a while, Midnight suddenly jumped up, her ears perked up, and ran downstairs. My heart started pounding, and I lay still on the bed, listening to everything. After a while, Midnight came back, but she didn't jump on the bed, but wanted to go outside. Even though it was dark and cold, I decided to take her out. However, instead of going to the bathroom like usual, she dragged me towards the dense forest where I had seen the footprints before. She also sniffed around the house and looked up at the roof. I tried to pull her back, but she just sat down, staring into the darkness ahead. When we went back inside, I heard the sound of footsteps on the roof again. My heart sank, but I tried to calm myself down by thinking that maybe it was just a falling pine cone or some wild animal. But the footsteps were steady, like a person walking. Midnight heard them too and ran to the balcony door, demanding that I open it so she could go out. I told myself that I was strong and shouldn't be afraid, so I put on my coat, put on my shoes, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out onto the balcony. Everything was strangely quiet. There was no sign of anything on the snow on the roof. I took a deep breath, trying to relax, but then my eyes caught something that stopped me dead in my tracks. On a pine tree about 20 feet above the house, I saw a humanoid figure, squatting between 2 branches. It was about 8 to 9 feet tall, very thin and pale. Its long arms were tightly gripping the branch above, while its mouth was wide open, expressionless. I didn't know if I was actually seeing this or not, but I didn't dare move. Midnight stood behind me, started moaning and pacing back and forth. I wanted to shine a flashlight on it, but a voice in my head kept screaming at me not to. I slowly backed into the house, pulling Midnight along and locking the door. When I shone the flashlight outside, the thing was gone. I pulled the curtains back and went back to bed, But not long after, I heard a light knock on the balcony glass door, as if someone was tapping with their fingertips. The knocking lasted for almost an hour, steady and never stopping. Midnight just sat there staring at the door, but she didn't dare to come closer. The strangest thing was that I felt like someone was inviting me to open the door, but at the same time I heard my father's voice in my head, telling me to stay in bed. I decided to listen to my father, lie still and try not to pay attention to the knocking. Finally, I fell asleep because I was so tired. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling of extreme fear. Without hesitation, I packed up everything and immediately left the wooden house. I don't know exactly what happened that night, but one thing is for sure, I will never go back there again. My family owns a house in Vermont, where we often go in the winter to ski and snowboard. The house is on top of a hill surrounded by dense woods. The nearest neighbor is up the road, but far enough away that their house is not visible from ours. In addition to the main house, we have a large shed outside where we keep a lot of our skiing equipment, along with yard care tools like shovels, rakes, and more. We always lock the shed when we are not there, but once it is unlocked, we usually leave it open during the holidays because we don't worry too much about someone stealing things. The main house is quite spacious, with 3 floors, with the 3rd floor being a loft where the master bedroom is, reserved for my parents. We, the kids, are not allowed to use it. One weekend, I brought a girl named Melissa to this house. I decided to teach her how to skateboard since she had never skated before. We had a beginner's skateboard and all the necessary equipment. On our property, since it was on a steep hill, we had built a small slope for skateboarding or snowboarding. Before taking Melissa to the real mountain, I offered to teach her the basics on this slope. We put on all the equipment and climbed to the top of the hill. I slowly slid down, showing her the basic moves. The first time she tried, she fell right away, which I had expected. But Melissa was very persistent. Every time she fell, she got up and tried again. Every time we reached the bottom of the hill, she improved a little. Then we climbed up and tried again. While we were skiing, we suddenly heard a male voice from the woods. It seemed like he was calling us. The voice said, "Hello." We looked around in surprise, but there was no one to be seen, just a white strip of snow covering the ground and the silent trees. I thought that in the white of the snow, it would be easier to see someone, but no, we didn't see anyone. I shouted, "Is anyone there?" But there was no answer. There was only the dead silence of a remote place in winter. Melissa and I felt a little uneasy, so we decided to go back home and go inside. I didn't think it was the neighbors, because I didn't see their driveway cleared of snow. Besides, people who lived further up the hill had no reason to be here. I reassured Melissa that it was probably just someone walking in the woods, which was the least scary reason I could think of. After that, we went to our favorite nearby diner and then went shopping for basic food for the next few days. When we got home, it was quite late, so we decided to stay home for the evening. We had dinner and sat around the fire in the backyard. Suddenly, we heard footsteps in the snow, not far from where we were sitting. I turned off the music to listen, but with the fire crackling, it wasn't completely silent. However, the footsteps disappeared. I asked Melissa to borrow my phone so I could use both my flashlight and hers to shine into the woods. I called out again, "Is anyone there?" which frightened Melissa, and she ordered us to go inside immediately. We didn't go back outside that night. The next morning, I woke up and found Melissa already up. I was still tired, so I went back to sleep. But when I woke up again, she was still not in bed. I looked at the clock. It was almost 9 a.m. I got up and opened the curtains. Looking outside, I saw the barn door open and someone's breath coming from behind the door in the cold air. I thought it was Melissa, so I opened the window and called her name. But when she answered, her voice came from inside the house, right in the living room. I felt a chill down my spine. I continued to look outside and saw the breath still coming from behind the shed door. I shouted, "Who's in my shed?" After a few seconds, I closed the window and ran to the living room, where I saw Melissa standing in front of the sofa, looking worried. I looked out the back door and saw a person dressed in black running into the woods. I quickly looked for my shoes to chase after them, but by the time I finished putting them on, the person had disappeared. I went out to check the shed, but nothing seemed to be missing. I locked the shed door for safety The person's footprints led from the woods into the shed, then back into the woods. I didn't dare follow those footprints, feeling that it was unsafe. After calming down, we had breakfast and decided to go skiing. Melissa was a quick learner, and we planned to have another day of skiing the next day. In the evening, after returning home, we cooked a steak dinner and watched a movie. We both decided not to go out in the dark anymore after what had happened. In the middle of the night, I woke up when Melissa shook me. She explained the reason and told me to listen. We sat in silence for about 30 seconds before we heard, "Help me," coming from outside. The voice was long and desperate. Melissa started to panic. The screams rang out again. I went to the window. She begged me not to open the curtains, but I said I just wanted to look for a bit. I gently lifted a corner of the curtain and looked out. I didn't know what I expected, but it was absolute darkness outside. I gently opened the window to hear where the screams were coming from. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the snow, getting louder and louder, as if someone was running toward the window. I quickly closed the window and locked it, but the person had seen me. The knocking on the window confirmed it. I looked over at Melissa, who was hiding under the covers, sobbing. I told her that it was best not to react or acknowledge the presence of the person. We sat in silence. No more knocking or cries for help. It was a long, tense night, but we were finally exhausted and fell asleep. The next morning, I checked around the house and saw footprints all around the house from window to window. It was clear that someone or people had been watching us since we arrived. We decided to leave the house earlier than planned. I locked everything in the shed. Then we got in the car and drove back to Rhode Island. For those curious, nothing was broken into, or stolen the next time we returned to the house. I can't guess what the person was after, but it was certain that he had been watching us since we arrived, and it was probably more than one person. In such a remote place, realizing you weren't alone was the scariest thing you could imagine.